Thank you, Matt. First announcement I make. This is just came up. If you are available tomorrow at 3 p.m., the Spring Concert of Worship, the DeMoss Center Spring Concert of Worship, is going to be here in Herrick Chapel. I'm going to be in the percussion ensemble, the jazz ensemble, and the choir as well. And of course, the main event is actually Professor Folker and his Magic of Music performance thing. So be here tomorrow, 3 p.m., and then go to church on Sunday. Secondly, you remember this guy right here? This guy is Dale Olson. He's going to be here on Monday at 10 a.m. In Herrick Chapel. He's going to do a music set for Celebration Chapel. Dale Olson is also a former touring member of Citizen Way, so he's going to be here for that day. This event is also sponsored by the Judson Bike Shop, thanks to John Ashworth. And so we'd love to see you there. And I'm going to pass the microphone to Mr. Olson, and he'll tell you more about what's going to happen that day.
Okay, real quick. So if you're here Wednesday, you know the drill, but it's Celebration Chapel. So we're going to be celebrating the seniors next Monday. It's going to be a party. It's going to be a short chapel, and we're going to be celebrating their accomplishment getting through college. I was in accounting, and I almost failed, actually. So I know it's a big deal to finish. So be here next Monday. It's going to be a party. You'll get chapel credit. It'll be short, and we're going to play a blistering fast set of fun music. There will be games. It'll be a good time. So, and I'm going to be giving away $100 at the end, okay? So I will see you guys there. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Josh Jones, and this morning's chapel is all about Gen 401. I know, try not to get too excited. I want to first thank Chris and Brandon for letting us take over chapel. Dr. Sandberg and I, who are currently teaching Gen 401, kind of decided that it would be relevant and fun to share some of our thoughts about the core concepts around the class, because every student ends up taking the class anyway, right, at some point. So there's, needing to get some of that information out and to equip students who will be taking the course eventually with some of the expectations that go into that class. And so we can share some of that stuff. And of course, Dr. Sandberg and I were talking about how ministry is an important part. Our worship ministries at our respective churches are an important part of how we live out a lot of these concepts we talk about in Gen 401, and we thought, okay, well, there's no better appropriate way of starting than with some singing. So we've got a few songs to sing here first at the top, but I want to also extend a thanks to Dr. Warren Anderson, who's helping us out on the bass this morning. And the one with hair over there is Tiger, who is helping us out on the drums. So thank you very much, guys, there. But let's start with the song Good Grace. One of the themes in our Gen 401 class is human flourishing. We talk a lot about human flourishing, what that means, and how we contribute to it. And we talk about social issues, and the one we're talking about currently, of course, is around food. But it's all about community and how we affect that community. And this song talks about that, how we're all united together in the truth of God. So let's start with Good Grace. So will you please stand up and let's worship together. Here we go. Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. Take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh, 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 oh. Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. Take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh, our salvation is in his blood. Jesus, light of heaven, friend forever, his kingdom come. Amen. Amen. This next song I got from our church's hymnal. It was written in the 1960s, and it uses a folk song melody, which is a tradition that goes back hundreds of years, right, where composers take popular melodies and then set hymns to them. I chose this song not because it'll be familiar. It probably won't be very familiar, but it's catchy, and I'm hoping that you can sing along by the time we get to through it a little bit. I chose this song more because the text sort of perfectly represents some of the Gen 401 themes. If I were to sum up the course in one sentence, I would say that Gen 401 is an exploration of how faith traditions compel believers to contribute to human flourishing and how we might integrate that into our daily work. And I think that you're going to hear a lot of that narrative in these lyrics to this song. So here we go. This is Lord, whose love and humble service. 1, 2, 3. Lord, whose love in humble service bore the weight of human need, who upon the cross forsake, worked your mercy, perfect deed. We, your servants, bring the worship, not a voice alone, but heart, consecrating to your purpose every gift which you impart. As we worship, grant us vision, till your love's revealing light in the height and depth and greatness dawns upon your quickened sight, making known the deeds and burdens your compassion bids us bear, stirring us to ardent service, your abundant life to share. Called by worship to your service, forth in your dear name we go, to the child, the youth, the age,
servants, blood and freedom. May your mercy know and live.
Amen.
So, Gen 4.1 can sound an awful lot like trying to solve the world's problems, which it's supposed to be about solving problems. But it's easy for that to become a task to do, another check off, a work to be done. So one of the things that we talk about is that this should be driven by the Christ that empowers us. So we're singing Great Are You, Lord, that has the words, your breath in our lungs give us the strength that allows us to do the kind of service that has been laid before us. So let's put our trust there. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. You give life, you are love, bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. All the earth. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for your calling on our lives to live it out for you. We thank you for minds that allow us to process and to do it in ways that make sense, to be reflective, to be agents for your kingdom. Amen. You may be seated. Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Sandberg. I teach math and physics here for those that haven't come across me. As Dr. Jones said, we are two of the Gen 401s. There's a third one, which is Dr. Kanya, who couldn't be here today, although he was hoping he could, but he had other things come up. But we invited Dr. Halverson because he is the chair of the General Education Committee. That's sort of the driver behind all the general education program, your Gen 101, your Gen 301, your Gen 401, all sort of filters through him. So he's part of the process of putting it together originally. So whatever you know about this class, it probably is mostly something about food, which is not really what it's about. Hang on one second. Close my file. I don't know where that went. Okay, so hopefully you've got questions on that. Yeah. You do. Sorry about that. So I want to just point out a couple of things before we get into the questions that drive us, is that we don't just randomly pick a class of this. There's a number of things that have gone into it. If you read our university mission statement, toward the end, it talks about that we challenge students to be effective ambassadors for Christ, people that go out and make a difference. Every August, we read the 1968 Statement of Purpose, which talks about challenging you to weigh among the various options, what will you do? How will you take your approach? Our tagline that you see on our webpage is shape your life to shape the world. And that's what we've wanted Gen 401 to be, is how do you do that in ways that are purposeful, that are planned and intentional, give you some ways to balance it. And that we've used this language of conversation, Gen 101 as you're entering the conversation, Gen 401 continuing the conversation. And so we thought, it's time for us to have part of the conversation. We're trying to get you guys to do the conversation in our classes, but maybe we would share some of our reflections. And so the first question I want to just to think about is, what does flourishing look like? That's one of the questions that we ask you in Gen 401, Gen 101. And so what do we imagine it? How does it play into the way we want to see the world done?
Fair enough. One of the texts that one of the readings that we use in the class is by this theologian, Miroslav Volf, who defines human flourishing in three parts: leading life well, life going well, and life feeling good. And typically, I've found that when I discuss this with students, that the most challenging one, or at least the one that we have to kind of unwrap the most, I think, is life feeling good, that last one. What does that mean exactly? And Volf associates that idea with joy. And what does that mean? And how do we get that in our lives? And I think it's difficult because most of us associate joy or life feeling good with different benchmarks or material things, even though we know we shouldn't. That's a lot of what we do with regard to that. And I find it helpful to talk about it in these following terms. And this is what I have to tell myself time and time again to kind of keep reminding myself what I need for life to feel good. And I think it is this pattern, this reoccurring pattern that happens in most of our lives, where we're not really looking for joy, because that's kind of hard to define, as much as contentment or satisfaction. That's where a lot of joy in our lives comes from, is from a sense of contentment or satisfaction, or whatever word you want to plug in there. And the pattern that I use to pursue that, and what I share with a lot of my students, is there's this pattern of taking responsibility and finding meaning in that responsibility, and then achieving some degree of joy, contentment, satisfaction. And that looks very, very different for everybody. Sometimes we actively take responsibility for something. I don't know if that's a work project, or if that's a class that we're teaching. Is that classwork that you're doing? Is that a relationship that we're in? What does that look like? I don't know. But sometimes we take responsibility, and sometimes responsibility is kind of put on us, right? Either way, accepting that responsibility and then instilling some degree of meaning into that work, that responsibility, whatever that is. What is that meaning to you? How is that meaningful to you in your life? What does that look like? And then when we work into that meaning, when we take that responsibility, work into that meaning, that eventually leads to some degree of satisfaction, contentment, joy. And I feel like that pattern is something that we need to kind of drill down into a lot in our lives for finding that aspect of what human flourishing is. So that's the one that speaks most to me.
Thanks for bringing up Wolf. If you haven't had Gen 4.1, that was probably still rang familiar to you, because it's also the opening reading for Gen 101, because there's a plan here. Doesn't always seem like it, but there's a plan. Flourishing. I said I haven't taught the course in a couple years, but we do try and touch on it, or I try and touch on it in other courses because we should, because it's important. And the life going well and leading life well, which Wolf sometimes says, look, you can lead your life well and it could result in it not going well, like Jesus, right? Or the disciples, right? In human terms, it didn't go well for them in many ways. But I just finished up History of Civ 2, another favorite course among people besides Gen 4.1, and I see a couple veterans are there. I see Anna, I see Hayden. Then if I see farther back in the house lights reflect off my glasses and I can't see anybody. But Wolf talks about living life well as love, right? We're supposed to love our neighbor. And life going well as peace, maybe this contentment or things being arranged rightly. And to a certain extent, I think living life well, if we're loving and loving our neighbors, is living life well is doing what we can so that those around us, their life goes well, right? Oftentimes we think about maybe making it that our life goes well. But I think we should just live life well and see what happens. But I brought this up, and I won't call on them. There's an approach that it's complicated. I'm going to boil it down. That a lot of Christian thinkers are using now when they talk about, say, we just talked about globalization, which gets into food, because you've probably paid more for food lately because of global food supplies, and lots of people argue: are things getting better or getting worse? Right? Are people flourishing more, or are they not flourishing more? And you could look at things like reductions in poverty rates, increases in life expectancy, which are good things. They also are good things because you can measure them. But there's also something called what's called the capability approach. And does somebody are they living in a context? Do they have the ability to do the things they value doing and to live out their capabilities and the gifts and skills that God has given them? Or is something about their context holding them back? And to a certain extent, I think of human flourishing is the ability to flourish. You know, I have these aspirations, right? I have, and you, at your age, probably more aspirations than I have. I'm sort of at the other end of this. But are you enabled? Do you have a context? Do you have a situation in your life where you can participate in your community in a meaningful way? That you can reasonably think, I can actualize my goals. So God is calling me to this, right? Do I live in a context in which it's going to be very difficult for me to follow that call or not? And to me, human flourishing is, are you living in a context in which you can do that, to truly flourish? And I also think we also talk about, one of the prompts is, how do we connect it to the common good? Which I don't think are different things. The more all of us flourish, the better it is for everybody. Just because it's going well for one person doesn't mean it has to go bad for somebody else, right? The more people who are allowed to live into the gifts that God has given them, the more everybody benefits, right? The more people are allowed to be creative and productive and to live life well, the better all of our lives are going to be. I really do think that. And we don't talk about that all the time, but it can come up in a lot of different classes. So, flourishing.
One of the aspects of flourishing that I've grasped onto, and I'm pretty sure it's out of the Wolf reading, is the sense of that the world is not as it should be. Our lives are not as it should be. You can talk about sin, you can talk about the fall, the aspects. And so that part of the task is restoring people to the place, the abilities, the powers that they were intended to be when we think back to the Garden of Eden and the relationship with God and to work the ground and tend the ground. And so one of those aspects particularly gets into the life feeling good is, when can we enable or be part of the task of bringing other people to life being as it should? I was reading N.T. Wright a couple weeks ago talking about our vocation of royal priesthood. Those of us that are believers, God has appointed us to bring restoration, to bring reconciliation. So our flourishing is, how do we enable people to bring to where life is the way it should be, where they're not struggling with daily needs, and we talk about something like food, but also that they have choices to make. They can, the life doesn't have all the pieces taken away, so that there's no options for them, poverty or whatever choices that they're restricted. And so trying to open up those kind of pieces.
Can I address the? I know that it's called the food class on campus, and the class isn't about food. When it first was it 2014, 2015. I know you were one of the original instructors. The topic was immigration and migration. Now it's food. In a year or two, it might be something else, right? To a certain extent, I mean, the topic is important, but the topic doesn't matter, right? We can't just go in and have a conversation about human flourishing. Then we're just navel-gazing and we're talking in abstracts, right? But to talk about it in a particular context, and whether you think food is a great context for that or not, it gives us something to hang on to, right? And certainly living life well and life going well can play into a concept like food or immigration and migration, right? People literally geographically changing their context so that they can flourish more, and then other people going, well, if they all come in here, maybe I flourish less or more, right? There's arguments that way. But and you have to take this to graduate, right? Try not to think about it as the food class. Food is just the thing that's good for thinking, right? Although I think it's important. I like talking about food because I like food.
I really like our food book myself. But.
Well, it also is great because if you're not an expert, there's just a book. And so, we have a faculty member who says, well, I don't know anything about it. It's like, well, here's the book. Stay one chapter ahead of the students. But, and we're only really talking about food for what, 6-8 weeks? Yeah, in class. So try to get away from the point that I have to learn about food or immigration or whatever the next topic is going to be, and think about, and you talked about solving problems. To me, I find it easier to talk about addressing a problem because I can't solve it. right? I
I'm
just,
very careful, and all my paperwork says the word address,
Address,
not
yeah.
solve.
Yeah,
I keep
you know,
telling you, individual project, you're not solving problems.
in civ class, we talked about the war in Ukraine yesterday, and they're like, yeah, so what's next? I'm like, I don't know. It's a mess. You know, it's a mess, and I don't have a solution. Which are like, well, why did you just spend 75 minutes explaining it? But that the world can be pretty complicated, and there's ways to address what's going on without the overwhelming and really impossible task of saying, how do I solve it? And also to be thinking about, you guys all have a major, right? Yeah, if you don't, you should get one. At some point, I think you need one. And to a certain extent, also the class is, it may not seem like it, the class is about you, right? We give you the opportunity to do a research paper, I know, isn't that great? But about what you can do based on who you are after 3.5 years here, how you can address it. It's a fairly self-centered class in that sense, right? We're not asking you to imagine something so much in the abstract, but how, as an architect or a teacher or sports management, what can you do in your life, in your job, to address some fundamental issues so that people's lives go better?
We're going to come back a little more to the how do you get this into your own personal life a little bit with our third question. But the second topic we hit in Gen 4.1 is how do we go about engaging culture? What do we do? And we use a book that has 5 different views from 5 different sort of Christian backgrounds. But they range from do we make a difference by being examples, right? Do we show, hey, there's another way to live, right? And hey, look, this you might be interested in it, right? We're trying to do it. Or are you know what? Hey, let's get involved. Let's change the laws. Let's be very active about it. That kind of approach. Do we stand in a critical position with respect to the government and say, oh, that's not a good thing? Or do we stand, hey, let's get in there and let's do this stuff? And so part of the question we ask our Gen 4.1 students is, okay, well, which of these kind of engagement approaches fits? And so our question is for us is, what do we engage? And I'll go first. I am drawn very much to the community that sets apart and shows a difference, that there's a different way without coercing it forward. For me, that's coming a little bit out of my science side of teaching things, that there's often phrased, there's science and there's faith and there's problems and there's war, it's always phrased. And I think our department does a pretty good job of representing, no, here's a different approach where faith and science go well together. And we offer it to our students, we're not going to shove it down their throats, but hey, here's an option. And for those of you that are struggling, that feels like the world is not right because there's battles, here is a way, another way forward. So that tends to be my kind of draw.
I get stuck a lot when talking about this engaging brokenness in our world. I get stuck a lot because before that happens effectively, we kind of have to get past the polarized perspectives that we all have, right? Most of us are called to live in a pluralized society where we are constantly dealing with people who think differently than we do, right? And a lot of times we can't get past that to really create meaningful change. And to be fair, the book doesn't really do a great job of addressing how to get past that polarization, but there's a really wonderful passage, one of my favorite parts in the 5 Views on Christian Traditions on Politics book that we use. There's a really great passage in the Lutheran chapter that does address this. That author, when talking about the distinctives of his faith tradition, he talks about, the quote is, a sharp distinction between salvation offered by God in Christ and all human efforts. That's the sentence he uses. And that's a concept that most of us are going to be familiar with here, where we cannot buy our way into heaven. We cannot earn our way into heaven. That has already been done for us through the power of Christ, right? Through his sacrifice. And I think it's helpful to live in that truth where all of our efforts, all of our perspectives, all of our passionate beliefs, as strong as they are, we tend to get wrapped up in this idea that I believe this so strongly and I am right and I am righteous. And that other person who thinks differently than we do, they're wrong and they are evil, right? We fall into that trap so easily, all of us do. And this perspective that this author gives in this one passage, I find relieving, because he says we are all equidistant from or equally close to the grace of God, despite where we sit in those earthly fault lines, is the phrase he uses. But despite how we view this topic or how passionately we feel about this thing, we're always equidistant from or equal to the grace of God as that other person on that other side. And I find that very comforting, because I think it's on that common ground where eventually we're going to be able to get past this polarization. We are going to be able to really affect meaningful change and engage the brokenness in our world. So that's where I come from with that.
This may seem like a cop-out, and it might be partially, but I really, and I think the 5 views, and there's certainly more than 5, but a book can only be so long, of how Christians and various Christian traditions engage in the public good and human flourishing. I appreciate the diversity of witness. I think you're referring to the Anabaptist tradition of standing somewhat outside of culture and showing a different way of being, which certainly in the ministry of Jesus we're showed to do. But I'm also drawn, and this might be partially from my background, I was raised Lutheran, but also from the practicality of it, there's people starving in the world, and we're going to take all this upper and upper middle class Lutheran money and just airlift food in with Lutheran World Relief, or lobby the government to do something with Bread for the World. And I'm pretty glad there's both kinds of Christians in the world, right? Or even some of the other kinds. The long tradition of, say, Catholic social doctrine that we learn about, in which they don't necessarily have to always be struggling with what do we do now, right? They've got 1,500 years of thinking about it. I think that the diversity of the witness and the diversity of the way Christians see how they're supposed to live out their love for others in very different ways, I think is really valuable, and in different contexts appropriate. And maybe some traditions are more suited to address different problems. And I think it also depends on where you're at, right? Some of these traditions come at the problem from a position of power. Roman Catholic social teaching or the Lutheran tradition, these are traditions that have traditionally been powerful in societies, right? And say the Anabaptist tradition, or we talk about the Black church tradition, are traditionally groups that have been disempowered in societies, and they see different kinds of way of being Christians and different possibilities for impacting the world. So I know we make you choose one in the class, but it's a forced choice experiment, right? You're supposed to we don't really have time to have to do a long paper on, the best parts of each, but to appreciate all of them. And
I have to say, every time I teach a class, I pick a different one. I'm like, oh, that one is me. Then next year I read it, and that one. And so I find myself bouncing around all the time. And like I say, we tell you for your paper, we need you to pick one and do the analysis just to do it. But I appreciate, there are times where I appreciate the Black church perspective of, hey, this is a really big problem, and we need government acting, and some of those other perspectives. What we ask you to do in your final big part of 10-4-1 is to put all these pieces together, right? So there's what you think flourishing means, how you want to engage, there's who you are as either your major or just as an educated person, and put all this together and address something about food, right? That is a way to do it. Address, not solve. So I asked us to kind of think, can we think of some ways where we have tried see our life, put these pieces together. There's a reading we used to use in a previous iteration where we talked about fit, that if I can fit these things together, that's harmony, it's where you want to be, right? All the notches are together. So I'll go first. So I teach mathematics, upper level mathematics, and one of the things that mathematics at that level is not about truth, it's about consistency. How do we pick rules and make sure that we're never contradicting ourselves. That's a major focus within it. Because as mathematics has come to understand through geometry and its history, that whenever it tries to put all the rules together, things go wrong. You get contradictions, and so it's been the practice to be very concerned. What's the fewest assumptions I must make to make an interesting mathematical device, whatever that is. And so my natural instinct is always toward what's the fewest pieces I need, what's the fewest statements I have to make in a way. And so when I approach questions of faith, that's often, what's the base level question, right? Number one, Jesus, right? What he means, his coming, his resurrection, his death. The call on our lives to follow and obey him. Do that. And so those would be two starting points. And I'd say, okay, of all the other things, what does it matter, right? There's a ton of stuff that gets dumped in. And I mentioned I teach the science side, and we get a lot of students that come in, they come to Judson as a science major, but they were told they're going to lose their faith because they're studying science. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about what are the basics. What are those? Let's go back to those basics and try to separate some of the baggage that has been put on. So I'm showing them an alternative way. I'm helping them think about it in very small terms so that they can get to a place where they do not feel their life is in conflict all the time, back to flourishing. Right? So that's an example that I try to pull.
I'm going to jump in here because I sometimes get the sense that our disciplines are the polar opposite, right? That I approach a problem, I'm like, we're going to just throw a bunch of balls in the air because this is really complicated. We were talking about the invasion of Ukraine yesterday, and I'm teaching about the 17th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which I didn't really know anything about until 2 days ago. That was yesterday. But I'd heard of it. But I think there's some value, and I think this is one of the reasons why students ask me, and like in my history class, I'll say, you're probably not going to remember hardly any of this. I'm like, well, why am I here? Because one, it's more that we're teaching you ways of thinking about things, right? And the way Dr. Sandberg teaches you to think in mathematics and the way I teach you to think in history are in many ways the complete opposite. But I'm not arguing with him, right? You need a bigger toolbox, a bigger intellectual toolbox as you go into the world, and to see, when is it appropriate to go, wow, this is really complicated and messy, and when is it appropriate to go, I need to just figure out, the simplest, the least amount of variables, because the answer isn't always one or the other. And sometimes the same problem, you can approach it from the same way. And that's one of the reasons I think something like Gen 401 is great, because we're asking you to approach it from the way, because your mind, particularly in your major, you're not just learning things, you're being shaped in a particular way, right? If you're an architecture major, you're being shaped to literally look at the world and the built environment in a way that I don't. Or if you're a math major, you are seeing the world in a way that I don't see the world. But through in particular with the capstone, we're introducing you to various different ways of seeing the world, whatever details you remember from these classes.
Very nice. We're going to move on, and as much as I know you guys enjoy hearing your professors talk away, because all of your professors love to hear themselves talk, right? As much as that's great, we also thought it was valuable to bring in a bit of a student perspective. Melina, if you want to come on up here. I asked Melina to step in, and the question that I asked her was, how has Gen 401 helped you make connections between your faith, work, community, and how that might play out in flourishing post-Judson? Nothing like a small, easy question to answer, right? So there you go, Melina.
All right, yeah. So I really liked this class. I'm like a huge nerd, so this is perfect for me. I love thinking about stuff like this, so I thought that this was just super interesting all the way through. But I really think that, like you guys have talked about, all three parts kind of fit together in a way, and I think it's perfect that you kind of take this class usually senior year or junior at the end, because it really gets you thinking and connecting everything, how first it starts with faith traditions, and I think it's set up so perfectly for people like us, because I feel a lot of people do come from, believe it or not, like whether you deny it or not, you come from the background where you're raised a certain way, and a lot of time you don't question it. You just kind of, keep going with that. And I feel like once you get to college or once you get to a certain age, you get the mindset where it's like, oh, like I want to separate myself from how I was raised and sort of think about it for myself, but you don't really know how to do that in a sense, so you just kind of don't. And I think what this is perfect, and like they've talked about how you use a book where there's 5 different faith traditions, and you're forced to look at it objectively. It's no matter really that much of like personal opinion, because for each chapter, you see all of the benefits and then you see all of the critiques. And then when you write your reflections on it, you have to write what you think are the benefits are and what you think are the critiques are, and then eventually pick one at the end. So I think it's just like perfect to get your mind set up in a way where you can like start to think for yourself, okay, like what do I personally, who I am now as a person, what do I agree with? What do I disagree with? And like which authors do I agree with? And then using that sort of as your motivation for everything going forward, no matter what your discipline is. And then moving forward to like the food stuff and the food issue. I think it's also perfect, like you guys said, that, it hasn't always been food and it won't always be food. It's perfect that it's just a random issue, because for me personally, like I'm in education, I'm gonna be a teacher. And if you ask me what the biggest issue in education is, food's not going to be the first one that comes to my mind. But then as you think about it and as you take the class, you really see like, oh, this affects my discipline in so many ways, and I'm sure it does for everyone out there. Like obviously food affects me, it's going to affect my students. So just like getting the opportunity to pick a random issue and see how you're going to address it. So then finally when you get to the end of the class and you're sort of putting everything together, I feel like the goal sort of, like you said, we're not going to solve the issue. Obviously, none of us are going to be the one to solve the issue. It's what can you do in your discipline? Like with everything you've been doing so far in these 4 years and the plans you have for your future, what is like one small thing that you can do to address one issue? Because again, then in the real world, my whole life is not dedicated to solving food. It's solving a lot of stuff. But now I've got the opportunity to say like, okay, I was able to come up with one specific plan to solve one specific issue with my discipline. So now I can kind of do this for everything and kind of think about, like what do I have? What are the core values that I have now? Because now I've gotten the chance to think about it. And like, so now I have the core values, and then just thinking about like, what can I do specifically to solve one specific issue? And I think that's something that's like really gonna stick with you. So it's really good to like get the opportunity in a class to kind of just like lay it all out and just like do it and write about it.
Grief, well said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me invite you to stand, and I will give a benediction and send you out. Dear Father, we thank you that you have given us reconciliation, and you have empowered us to go out and reconcile, to make difference, to bring flourishing to a world that is not as it should be. May we rest in the restoration that you have already put on us as we go out. Amen.
So much. You knocked out of the park. Golly.